that is my cue to say to all of you, welcome. I'm so glad you've joined us and have signed on to this conversation between Andrea Elliott and Matthew Desmond. And they're of course here to discuss Andrea's amazing new book, Invisible Child. Here it is, Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City. My name is Dorothea von Rotke. I'm one of the owners of Labyrinth Books. And I'm just so honored that we have as our two guests these two exceptional writers and researchers whose work, for all of its differences, in equal measure, I think, tells the story of the cycles of poverty and homelessness, also of the breakdown of the public institutions that are supposed to help the poor in the US. And we'll have time to get to all of this and much more in just a few minutes. First, I have a quick few thank yous to our friends at Princeton Public Library, also at Princeton University's Humanities Center, and then Housing Initiatives of Princeton. They're all our co-sponsors for this event, which, as all of you know, also is a fundraiser for the work of HIP. I want to be sure to mention that we'll have time for your questions. So please just put those in the queue. You can click on the QA button at the bottom of your screen, or you can just put them in the chat and we'll find them there as well. Don't keep them in your back pocket. Just as you have a question, put them in where we can see them, because it gives us a sense of how much time to leave for the Q&A. You know, just yesterday, news arrived of the police shooting and death in neighboring Plainsboro of a man who was being served an eviction notice. So should you think that the issues that we're here to talk about tonight are not pressing or local to where you are, wherever you are, please pause and rethink. And so therefore, before I introduce Andrea and Matt, the chair of HIP's board, Liz Limpert, who is also was our longtime wonderful mayor here in Princeton, is going to tell you now just a little bit about the work that your ticket supports and how you can get more involved if you want to, if you live in or near Princeton. So Liz, will you just tell us a little more?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to thank Andrea and Matt and Dorothea and Labyrinth for holding this event on behalf of HIP and for everybody on the call who's made donations. Housing Initiatives of Princeton helps families avoid eviction and set them on the path to economic stability. We run a transitional housing program with 6 apartments, and families are in the program for 1 to 2 years. And in addition to subsidized housing, they receive personalized case management and extensive wraparound services, including financial and career counseling, access to mental health services, tuition assistance, and a forever network of support. And we also work with our partners in Princeton's Housing Stability Coalition to provide rental assistance. Last year, HIP distributed $386,000 in rental assistance, including $258,000 in federal funds that went through the municipality of Princeton. With the eviction moratorium ending, this work is more necessary than ever. So please visit our website, and I'll put it in the chat, housinginitiativesofprinceton.org. And you can sign up for our email blasts to learn more about our work and to learn how to help. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and all of you who have already begun to read or have read Invisible Child will know how important that kind of a model of wraparound services can or could be where it isn't in place. So that's especially important. But now on to our guests. Many of you will have read Andrea Elliott's extraordinary reporting in, I think, 2013 or so for the New York Times about the life of Dasani, whom she accompanied for 12 years of uprooted living, together with her large family as they cycled through shelters and Section 8 housing, shuttled from school to school throughout New York City, beyond New York City. Invisible Child grows out of that reporting and has won many accolades. Before that, Andrea had already received a Pulitzer Prize for her series on a Muslim leader in Brooklyn that she also wrote for the Times. And if I could have wished for anyone in the US at all to talk with Andrea tonight, it would have been Matt Desmond. His Pulitzer Prize and National Book Critics Circle Award winning book Evicted changed the conversation about homelessness in the US. He is professor of sociology at Princeton University, where he's also the founder and principal investigator of the Eviction Lab. And finally, I just want to say that reading Invisible Child kept me up and made me late for work a few times. What I find that Andrea and Matt have in common is maybe that in their writing, they both capture and convey the spontaneous eloquence of their subjects and have a way of dignifying the poor, even as they bring us close up to the conditions of squalor and of systemic inequality that shape their lives. The effect for me of that is to kind of re-encounter all the ways in which whatever our capacity for empathy is, inaction is still a kind of complicity with injustice. And while I was reading Invisible Child these past few weeks, I was also reading a lot of Seamus Heaney. And I found these lines that relate to this. Seamus Heaney writes, and decently, we relapse into the wrong grammar, which kept us allied and at bay. So if anyone is inspired tonight to get out of that wrong grammar, reaching out to Liz at HIP is a really good place to start. And now I want to get out of the way, and on everyone's behalf, Andrea and Matt, I'm just so glad that you're with us.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi, Matt.
So I want to thank you so much for this book. I want to thank everyone on this call. If you have a question or a comment, put those in the chat or the Q&A, and I will read them throughout the talk. I want to thank Labyrinth for just being like the best bookstore in the United States, and thank HIP for all the inspired work that you do. Like a good academic, I want to start my questions with a comment and just say, you know, this is an incredible book. This is an incredible book. This is a book that comes around, you know, once a decade, you know, and it's a book that it pierced me. The stories in this book stay with me, and they're going to stay with you. If you haven't read this book, I'm begging you to do so. It takes on one of the most morally urgent problems of the day, but it does so in such a hard-earned way and such a beautifully authentic way. And so I just want to congratulate you for this incredibly special, important book. Thank you for it.
My God, thank you. To hear that from you is just a seminal experience. Really, truly appreciate it.
So for folks that maybe don't know the work or read the incredible Dasani reporting in December 2013, but that was a while ago, let's bring us back to the beginning. You know, you spent, I think, 8 years reporting on this book. That puts you in incredibly rarefied territory. The only other book that comes close is Random Family by Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc, which all of us know and love. So tell us how you got started, and tell us like why you felt that you had to report on this for such a long time.
So how it began was, you know, I had spent years working on immersive reporting kinds of projects, which were human-driven narratives. So this was familiar territory in that respect. But oddly, how this began was with me just looking at a statistic on a computer screen. So in a way, it's ironic that my most human endeavor ever began by literally staring at my computer screen and seeing that 1 in 5 kids was growing up poor. And that just kind of astounded me. And I remember calling my colleague, Jason DeParle, and talking to him because he'd been doing such amazing work on poverty for so long. And, you know, he was also a little surprised that it was still so high.
Yeah. And
I guess I just wanted to, it's also the highest child poverty rate of almost any developed nation in the world. It's gotten a little bit better with some of the pandemic related programs, but now we have the end of the child tax credit. So again, I think we're going to see, it's more like 1 in 7 now. It's going to be back at 1 in 5. And that is just astounding if you think about, you know, the idea that 1/5 of our future workforce is growing up in adversity. That led me to Dasani's doorstep, which on this sunny day in October, I was standing outside a homeless shelter in Brooklyn, just trying to find my way into one kid's life. And her family walked out in this kind of single file formation that they often walked like that, because according to her mother, that was how you survived the street.
Yeah.
And they just exuded this like magnetism and unity, and made me want to follow them in a way. And it's funny, I haven't actually shared this with anyone publicly, but Chanel reminded me of it the other day, that in those first few weeks, I was so determined to get to know them better. And from the first conversations, I was just so drawn to them, and especially to Dasani, because she was just such a little spitfire. She just had like everything that came out of her mouth, I wanted to write down. And one of the first things I wrote down was Dasani like the water. That's how she introduced herself. She was very proud of her name, and, you know, the aspiration that it contained in sort of how it represented this other world, this world of people where you could actually afford to buy water. But in the beginning, they really were trying to dodge me. I was this annoying outsider, and plus cell phones were very unreliable, as you know from your reporting. I mean, this is a world where there's just very little predictability, and addresses, cell phones, everything changes, schools constantly. And so they would come out of the shelter, and Chanel would be like, is the white lady still there? The kids would be like, yeah, she's still there, mom. Like, damn it, wait for me to leave. So eventually they shared that story with me. But in the beginning, I just remember standing around a lot and finally sitting down in a park with them. And really, I think that was when our relationship began.
Mm-hmm.
And to your question, I mean, I never thought it would be, it was 2012 to the last scene in the book is 2021. Right. So nearly a decade, right? And I couldn't have imagined that. And I don't think I would have allowed myself to do that as a mom of 2 small kids. At that time, I was still married. And then, you know, you see the transition that occurs in my life and in theirs over that near decade. And it was just so much change, so much that I witnessed, that I was trying to constantly keep up with new systems that I had to understand in real time as calamities occurred. And I think I just felt like I couldn't stop the reporting and needed to go in the direction that it merited, the story merited, which was deep dives as much as I could into history and into various policies and systems, and even personal narratives, just to be able to do justice, or at least try, to what felt like a really complicated story, not something you could just summarize. The series, and I'm so grateful for your kind words about it, when it ran, and this was just a year after I'd been following them, to me, it felt like I had just scratched the surface. Right. It really didn't. I knew that there were so many, it was just a first very, very rough, I couldn't even call it a first draft of the book. It wasn't even the book. It was just a bunch of signposts leading me into the directions that I ended up taking.
Right. And so how does that leave you with respect to the people that are making all the decisions about poverty today? You know, especially the social distance between the lives of families like Dasani's and Chanel's and people that are writing federal policy, or even, you know, the average American voter. You know, if you spent this deep dive for a year with a family and thought, I still don't have my hands around it. I mean, what are the implications for that, for big policy change, you think?
I think that your book and other books, and hopefully this one, are maybe the way that you bridge that gap, because I don't know how policymakers spend more time with the people that they're writing, that they're crafting their policies around. I think the people on the ground need to be a part of the conversation, obviously. What what is clear is that, you know, so much of what I saw it wound up being sort of defined fate for Dasani, wound up so often being in the hands of random circumstance, not really well thought out policies, so much as you got lucky by virtue of the caseworker who landed on your case, or the welfare worker who just sort of took pity on you that day. Just these really kind of like incredible, you know, almost random facts of just, you know, events would suddenly set into motion either a horrible snowballing, you know, cascading set of problems that resulted in the family breaking up or being evicted, or could potentially save them from huge problems. And so I think it's scary how much is left to chance. And I mean, we could talk about any particular system more in more detail, but yeah, I do think there's a very big disconnect between the lived experience and what is understood. I mean, Matt was reminding me, we were once on a panel together. I don't know if you want to share this. Can you share this? Well, he said to me, I remember immediately when he turned to me, or I think you said it to the audience, how many people in this room, and it was mostly academics, Andrea, do you think have a poor person's phone number in their cell phone? And I think my inside answer was none, but I actually thought maybe a few of them might have had a few. But yes, it's a problem. There is a huge disconnect. Right.
Reading all the travelogues about France by people who haven't been to Paris. So this is a tough question, but and I should say that conference this is the second time we've met.
Yes.
Right? Yes. So I want to just tell everyone, like, my admiration for Andrea and her book don't come from bonds of friendship or colleagueship. It's just a pure admiration. So here's a big question. What'd you learn about poverty? I mean, it's a kind of an unfair question, but you know, you started in a place where you were kind of shocked by the statistic. You ended after a decade of going through child protective services, visiting folks, you know, through jail and bail processing, seeing folks get housed and become homelessness again. I mean, what's one big takeaway you have from your experience?
I think being in this world caused me to rethink every popular concept that exists about poor people. I mean, I don't think that is an exaggeration. And I'll give you some examples. But before I do, I want to tell you a story about the origins of this project, which then turned into this book. And that was that at the times there was a lot of pushback when I pitched the idea of writing about one kid, in part because, you know, Jason's were extraordinary. There are not that many people who've done such great work. Your book hadn't come out yet. You know, it was a very, very high bar, random family. There were a few people who'd done it really beautifully, Alex Kotlowitz, but it wasn't, the Times is a place that holds a high bar to anything. And I loved that about the paper, but, you know, there was a resistance to what they called poverty reporting, and in the hands of anyone lesser than Jason, in the sense that those are the kinds of stories often that that tend to be sentimental, or that create, you know, that do the thing that I think I tried, and definitely in your work you've tried not to do, which is, you know, these are, I like to think of this as a very a story that connects the reader very intimately with the person in the story, not the kind of distance or separation that comes from looking at a poor person from a different perch, and the separation that exists in that kind of storytelling, where there's almost a built-in superiority, or a kind of feeling sorry for them. And so, you know, and then there's also, this was a time, 2012, where Occupy just happened. And we were entering into this era of really increased polarization in America. And I think that the paper was just like saying to me, basically, you know, we're going to be dealing with so much pushback. It's always, you know, there's just the personal responsibility camp. We know these arguments, and the structural camp, and poverty reporting that comes out winds up getting so much backlash, and people are fighting about that. And I said, well, what if I just write about the kids? Because wherever you are on the political spectrum, you can't deny that 16 million kids growing up poor in America is a problem, and they exist, and it's not their fault, right? It's not their fault that they are where they are. It's not their responsibility. And what I think I've come away with is that, you know, to know Dasani's childhood is to also have to know her mother's childhood, her father's childhood, and that within those adults exists these unseen former children. And I think that that is the biggest thing. I think when we look at the adults and we assign blame to chronically unemployed or chronically addicted or chronically unhoused men and women and parents, we are forgetting the things that happened to those human beings before they became the adults that they are. And those things are deeply connected to systems and problems and barriers that are so much greater than any one person. So the sort of like the things that surprised me when you think about chronic unemployment, but then you spend time with the deeply poor day in, day out, day in, day out, what you see is everyone's working. Yeah. Everyone's working. You're working all the time, around the clock. Even just the psychic task of trying to figure out how you're going to put the next meal together for your kids, how you're going to make sure that nobody's cold when it snows, or that their feet aren't wet, or that you're not going to be thrown out of the shelter or evicted from your home. It's an incredible amount of work. And I think I still have yet to meet anyone who didn't want a job. There's also this idea that they want to depend on the government, that the poor would rather sort of live off of these benefits than help themselves. And you actually, pointed this out in your incredible review of the book, which I so appreciate. This is a family that could have qualified for SSI. 3 of their kids would have brought in disability benefits that might have been hundreds of dollars, maybe even over 1,000. And they knew that, and they didn't. And they did it because they didn't want their kids to feel labeled. This is a family that absolutely loved language and was very interested in studying the dictionary every night, and just and focused on the meaning of words for various reasons. And disabled was the opposite of what they wanted their kids to be, which was to feel enabled, empowered. And so that was worth the loss of dollars that would have made a huge difference, and that are justifiable for many families to seek those benefits. I actually don't disagree with it. I'm just pointing out that this is a family that I think it's easily written off in that way until you know them, until you spend time with them and you actually get to know them. I mean, another big concept I think out there is this notion that poor folks are undisciplined, that they spend their money on the wrong things, that there is no thinking of tomorrow or ability to plan. And I think, any of these things are reductionist. You can't really dismiss a whole population with a view that is like that. But at the same time, it is really important to see that, first of all, the power of money is huge. When I don't think of this as, when I think about poverty, I think about what it means in terms of lack, not presence. It's the lack of materials, right? It's that there isn't this thing that if it was there, you wouldn't be poor, right? And so when you think of poverty as the lack of something, and then you think of what that thing is, which is money, and then you see its arrival, its sudden arrival after you've been suffering through days of all the things that I just mentioned, including the worst of them are often for kids, food insecurity. You suddenly have some cash. Who wouldn't, go blow it on a great meal somewhere, or maybe a beer. I mean, it's so easy to judge these things. But also, though, this is a very disciplined community in the absence of money. I mean, because survival is so intertwined with one's ability to plan, to think, to plot. And it's a certain discipline that I don't think is captured in traditional measures. And so by that, I mean, Chanel, Dasani's mother, never wore a watch, but she had this way of always remembering the big court dates, what time to get off. Like she would wake up right before the bus stop where she had to get off. And she remembered, she just was able to survive in ways that I think a lot of upper middle class parents I know wouldn't be able to.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there in your answer, right? And, one of the things was how the past really haunts the present. And I think one way to read Supreme's story, right, and kind of evaluate him as a father is, he can be kind of tough on his kids, right? And he did things that you'd think, gosh, I that seems like an immoral act. And then you really read about his childhood. And he's like orders of magnitude better than, what he faced, right? And like, he really has progressed massively since where he's been. And I loved your point about measures. I remember, my roommate in Milwaukee, his name was Wu, and he would wake up before me. He would work his first job. He'd come home. I'd see him at dinner. He'd go work his second job, all for cash, right? He would be, statistically, he's like an unemployed person. And he's basically working these double shifts. So I think that there was so much in their answer. I do want to ask you a question about pushback, though.
Yeah.
Because after my review of your book came out in the Times, I started getting emails, and there was this one theme in the critical emails, and I'll bet you could guess what it is. But it was, why do they have so many kids?
Yeah.
8 kids. And I'm sure you're getting this question a ton on the road. And so I'd love for you to reflect. I'd love for you first just to tell us how the family came together. But then I'd love for you to maybe reflect on what that question tells us about us, what we're doing with that question, so to speak.
Yeah, that's great. That is, I think, probably the central criticism. It's not criticism, it's a criticism of them. And I tried to, grapple with it in the book. This family came together very deliberately.
Yeah.
I think that there's this sense that, especially a poor family, produces a lot of kids just because, accidentally, irresponsibly, or even worse, because they think there's something in it for them in terms of government aid. As Chanel once said, we were talking about the tropes like welfare mom, welfare queen, which is ironic because the welfare office was in Queens, and she's like, I never feel like a queen when I'm here. To anyone, she said, who thinks that she had 6 children naturally, and she adopted 2, or she was their mother, de facto mother. And I'll get into that in a second. But to anyone who thinks I have babies to get some extra food stamps, I'd like to meet the mother who goes through childbirth 6 times for a few extra food stamps that won't last through the end of the month. Yeah. It's just not, if you've been through childbirth, you know that anyway. But she met Supreme. She had 2 kids. He had 2 kids from different relationships. They both wanted to create a home, a traditional family, for reasons that had to do with repairing their own pasts, but also seeing how the world worked, which in their world meant that if you had siblings, you had a better chance of surviving. They did not trust street family. Street family had become their replacement kin in the absence of their parents and siblings, and they had been both separated from those families of origins as young children through various systems. So they were wounded by that, and as they put it to me, the street became our family, and we didn't want the street to become their family too. We didn't want people calling our kids brother and sister who weren't really their brother and sister. And I think at the heart of that is this belief or this knowledge that your siblings, and some of them were step, but they were all being raised by the same parents in the same home, are going to protect you and stand by you like no one else. And in a world where you need that protection. And so it was a very deliberate plan, actually. It's interesting. You almost want to flip the idea around, because people say, how can they have so many kids when they don't know how to take care of them or aren't responsible enough to figure out how to feed them and clothe them and shelter them. And I think that they had those kids in order to survive this world that they were in, as a sort of like, as an answer, as a solution to that. And they did also see, I think, in ways that they admit were probably naive in the early days, a future that would be better than the one that they got. They saw, they were aspirational about it. They wanted a stable home, and they wanted to be able to work meaningfully and create the thing that they didn't get as kids. And it didn't quite work out that way.
Yeah.
But they never regretted having that many children, and the siblings are all to this day, I think, defined centrally by that bond. That is the most important thing in their lives.
Why do you think we latch on to that number?
Yes, the number. And why do we latch on to like so many kids?
So many kids.
It's interesting because yeah, I want to hear your thoughts. My mother's from South America, and I still am frowned upon by some of my relatives for only having two. It's oh, she's a real career girl. I think this is a story. This is a book. This is a reality that is about family. Ultimately, it is about the power and the bonds that come from family, and from the ultimate sense of belonging that family brings. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know why there is that resistance. I think that it has to do with, I think at times racism, I think at times classism. It's because if you're rich, you're allowed to have as many kids as you want. Nobody says a thing about it. Arguably, some of those kids could be just as neglected as these kids. It's really hard to be a parent. This is a family. I sometimes quote Mary Carr. Mary Carr said that the dysfunctional family is any family containing more than one member. This is a dysfunctional family. Like, every family can be found to be dysfunctional. This is a very dysfunctional family in some ways. But it was a family, to my mind, that was worth keeping together. And I think one of the greatest sadnesses of this book was seeing that it was not able to stay together, that it was actually broken up by city agency, and for reasons that are deeply rooted in poverty.
Yeah, I want to get to that in just a second.
But I would love to know your thoughts, actually, Matt, because I feel like
the sociologist Dan Bell once said that Americans are incredibly radical in economics and conservatives in culture. So we'll like tear down a forest, to build a factory, or like ship jobs overseas. And everyone's like, right. But if like you have sex outside of wedlock or a few kids, then that's the thing that scandalizes us. I think that, I think that there's something to be said there. I think that confronting a story like yours, a story like Dasani's and Chanel's, sometimes provokes in us we just want an off-ramp to justify the situation. And this is kind of a weird comparison, but do you remember the old Tom Wolfe book, The Right Stuff, where 1 in 4 Navy pilots were going up in these fighter jets and dying, because they're prototypes, and then the next day a pilot gets right in. He's like, well, that guy didn't have the right stuff. And I think that we are looking to someone like Chanel and saying, well, she doesn't have the right stuff, right? Because in America, you can ascend up the ladder as far as you can go, but you can ascend down pretty far too. And I think we all feel that a little bit, even those of us who are very far up the ladder. Poverty's a danger. So that's my random thoughts. I
really appreciate that, because I think that it doesn't just apply to the numbers involved in this family, or the sort of composition of the family. That view also informs how we understand Dasani herself, this child who is burdened with problems that are so big, that are beyond her control, everything from hunger to housing insecurity to a segregated school, and yet who has so much promise, so much potential, that it's easy to fall into the lane of, okay, she just needs to get out of this community. It's the narrative that I think we tend to celebrate when it comes to stories around poverty, is this narrative of escape of the one kid who got out. And that is an off-ramp, like you said as well, because then it's all about the child's potential, and we look for reasons to feel less bad about the situation that a kid like Dasani is trying to leave. If she can make it out, then really it's just the American meritocracy, story that, it's all about willpower and talent. And the problem is that there's so many kids, and Dasani's one of them, haven't made it out, are just as powerful in terms of their talents and their potential, that once you start to look at that pool rather than the 1% who do depart, you're forced to kind of stay back in the community, I think, rather than departing it, and looking at the limits of those communities that are no one's fault, right? It's so I think that I would hope that this story kind of forces a reckoning with that impulse to blame and to find excuses and reasons to then essentially throw up your hands.
Right. So let's talk about Dasani's break. So halfway through the book, the bell jar lifts. Dasani gets into Hershey School, right? One of the most well-funded private schools in the nation, right? For kids, as you say. It spends about $85,000 per kid per year. Deep investment of these kids. She goes to Hershey. She leaves New York. I don't want to give too much away, because for me, I found that portion of the book incredibly tension-filled. And it is about this question, right? Like, what's going to happen? Is she going to break the cycle? But I think it's not too much of a spoiler to say it's not a panacea, right?
Oh, yeah.
Why? What could have been different? 85,000 is a big investment. It wasn't enough in a way. Why? What could have been better?
I think Dasani's answer to that question changed. And so I want to follow her trajectory for a second. So in the beginning, she got this incredible opportunity and she embraced it. And sure enough, once you are removed from an unstable environment where you are interrupted constantly from achievement, right? By things like everything from, just being woken up throughout the night by noises outside your window to insufficient light and an inability to complete your homework assignments. All the things that she had to deal with at home were suddenly gone, and she had every need met, a full wardrobe, tutoring. She took off, and she leapt forward to grade levels in math. She began to really see her potential through as a sprinter. She'd only run on the street before, and suddenly she was on these tracks and on the team. And she was a very promising. She was off to a very promising start. And I think at that point, she was open to the things about Hershey that make the attempted escape, quote unquote, from poverty so complicated. And one of those things is the code switch. So often you will hear people talking about how they learn to switch between these different modalities, these different ways of speaking and of acting, dressing, to be able to move between different worlds. And everyone, to a certain degree, code switches. And so parents do that with their kids. They talk one way with them on the phone and another way with their colleagues. But this was a very big leap for any kid to make, because she was going from a predominantly Black community to a predominantly white community. She was being told to say isn't instead of ain't.
Mhm.
That was all okay. She was going with it. Until in her absence, her family fell apart.
Right.
And she then saw that her siblings were removed from the home, put in foster care and suffering. And I think it just became too much to bear, because every time she was called to make that switch in her mind, or even in how she spoke, she was reminded of the bond that she had left behind, and that the people that that bond represented, who then really needed her, and she wasn't there for them. So this is, I think, a thing that happens to most people who leave one community for another, is that they're torn in this way. But when you do it to a child, it's especially fraught. And I think, yes, so looking at what didn't work, I think that is breaking that bond with home is often seen by poverty experts as effective, as something that works. If a child at Hershey arrives at age 7, that child is much more likely to do well than at age 13, which is when Dasani got there.
Yeah.
Very pivotal age.
Yeah.
But is that a fair price to ask? I just keep coming back to that. I really think that her time at Hershey, it caused me to kind of rethink my own notion of success, for Dasani, for me, for anyone. If happiness, even if we define happiness as in these sort of material ways, and obviously we know that happiness is more than that, but you need stability in order to be happy. Okay, what does stability look like? It looks like a home that you're either renting or owning. You're not houseless. It looks like a job that brings you some kind of esteem. It looks like a small family, a manageable number of kids to support. And once you have those things in place, you can call yourself a member of this other America. That is the America, it's not the other, it's the America that you see on TV. But at what price? If it means that you are parting with everything you know, from the children you grew up loving as your siblings, not just loving, but knowing them as your central system of survival,
Yeah.
to the culture that you're really proud of. By the way, it's okay to say ain't. Why does it have to be this other modality? I just think I think that Dasani's ultimate answer to that question became, I want it both ways. I want to be able to stay rooted in my community and in my family, and to also have the right to thrive there.
Yeah.
I want to be able to transcend. I want to be able to arrive at this other America in my own context.
Yeah.
And she's trying to do it now. We can talk about her now, maybe a little later, but
This might be a good time for me to ask you to read a passage from your book, which has to do with family, with sisters. So I wonder if you'd read that for us. Then we have some questions that I'd love to get to from the chat and the Q&A, and circle back. Does that sound okay?
yes, thank you. Just as some background, in 2015, 10 months after Dasani got to Hershey, Child Protection Services removed her and her siblings from the custody of their parents and put them in foster care. The next few years for this family was very, very tumultuous. And Dasani's closest sister was her near twin, Aviana. They became estranged after being so close. So this now occurs a few years after they'd been separated. Forever Family writes Dasani on December 3rd, 2017, above a photograph on Facebook showing 3 new friends. They are throwing gang signs. Dasani, now 16, knows that her estranged sister, Aviana, will be rankled by this. To write Forever Family is Dasani's way of saying the opposite, that nothing is forever, not even family, that one's sister can be replaced as easily as one's own blood, which is not thicker than water, as their mother used to say. In the photograph, Dasani wears a red bandana in allegiance to the Bloods. One family is poised to take the place of another. Dasani has not seen Aviana in over a year. They last exchanged texts 5 months ago, but Dasani knows how to break her sister's silence. Precisely 2 hours and 35 minutes after Dasani posts the forever photo, Aviana appears on Facebook, clicking a digital hand. The hand waves at her sister. Dasani waves back. Hey sis, writes 15-year-old Aviana. A feverish correspondence follows. They agree to meet the following weekend at a subway station in Queens. They are both nervous, so Aviana needs detailed instructions. Dasani must take the A train to Broadway Junction, then the J train to Queens. To the last stop, get off, go upstairs, and then meet me at the turnstile. Queens is not Dasani's turf. She asks for the name of the station, which worries Aviana. Nothing can be left to chance. Instead, they settle on Broadway Junction, which is impossible to miss. Got you, sis, Aviana writes. On the afternoon of December 10, Aviana leaves her foster home in Queens, and Dasani leaves her foster home in Staten Island. They check their phones. I'm on the train, writes Aviana. Me too, writes Dasani. By 1:28 p.m., they are minutes apart. Both trains arrive and the sisters dismount. They cannot find each other. Aviana writes that she is here. Dasani writes that she's coming upstairs. Aviana writes that she's coming down. No, Dasani writes she's coming up. Where are you at? Dasani asks. Aviana is at the turnstile. Come to the escalators, writes Dasani. The thread stops. The station stops. Two sisters are crashing into each other. They have no words. They hold each other like refugees who have crossed an unseen border. Everyone is watching. Mind your own damn business, Dasani manages to shout from her sister's impossible clutch. She cannot breathe like this. No one hugs like this. You're holding me too tight. Let me go. Let me go. No one lets go. They stand like this for minutes. They already know their next move. The A train will come, taking them to downtown Brooklyn, where Chanel is waiting. The train is coming, the very train that their grandmother used to clean. It pulls into the station. The doors open.
Thank you for that. I think that passage reflects so much about that family, but also reflects so much about your reporting and how really attuned you were to this family. And there's moments in that, like that all throughout the book, right? Where an outsider might see one thing and you see it in a different way, maybe the way that the family sees it. And I think this speaks to a few questions we have. So one question is, did you ever feel like you shouldn't be there? There was something too personal, too close for someone that who wasn't a member of the immediate family?
I felt that way often.
And
I mean, there were times, I think, you know, we had a language between us where if they really needed, if something really upsetting had happened and they needed space, they would signal to me that they or I would offer to step away. There were times when they didn't want me to step away. I don't know. This is one of the most complicated subjects for me to talk about. It's the relationship and how to even describe it. I think it was just a constant work in progress. And I was always second guessing myself. Like, am I doing this the right way?
Right.
It's so hard. It's deeply personal. It's also what you're there to do as your job. And then the fact that those two things are coexisting is on your mind and on their mind. I think what they saw was I cared, and I'm a human being with my own kids, my own ups and downs. And we got to know each other's kids. Chanel said to me in the beginning, if I wasn't a mother, she wouldn't have let me near her kids. I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times when I didn't intervene, when I probably feel like I should have. And I don't know how you, at the end of the day, come out of something like this with clear answers about how to do it the correct way. I just think it's a conversation you have with them constantly as well. And I also have learned as a reporter to allow for the presence of emotions, to just welcome them and allow them in rather than to see them as a threat to the integrity of my reporting. I actually think that one's writing can be elevated by one's own humanity. And as long as you can also step back at certain points and have really smart readers come in and help make sure that you know, other perspectives are in the mix, or this is it's like, it's a project. It's a project. It's not something that gets done quickly or easily.
Yeah. A lot of folks want to know how Dasani's doing, and a lot of folks want to know how she responded to the book.
Yes, so we were talking about this earlier. I'll start there. I think that Matt was sharing that, you were sharing that people's relationship to your book has changed over time, people in the book. Sometimes it's like it's malleable, you know, and I found that all often as a reporter before the book, that a story would come out and there were usually like 3 waves of reactions. The first is whatever it is. It could be joy, it could be anger. The second is what everyone else thinks you should be feeling. And so you hear that, you're like, wait, I thought you liked this piece. No, you hate it now. Usually the final reaction is where that person ends up. But I think it's a negotiation, and it's, you know, we're all very impacted or informed by what other people think, especially people close to us or people we admire. And so when they read something that's been written about us, of course, we're going to second guess our own initial response. So I think that I saw that through with Dasani's family. That was one of the blessings of having written about them early on, was they could see how my reporting informed my writing and reporting, and they could also see how their story held up to scrutiny or how other people responded. And it was painful at times. Dasani's response in her first interview, which hasn't aired yet on the BBC, was that she's proud of the book, that she saw how hard it was. And she was very much a partner in the reporting, as were her parents, because I needed them to be able to file Freedom of Information Acts, or I did on their behalf, in order to get the documents that we needed so often. And I think that it was painful for her. I actually spent 5 days reading it to her and her sister out loud, because as they were teenagers. I don't trust any teenager to read a book this size. They said they would read it, but their parents read it, of course. And I also wanted to put myself through the, at times, torture of actually watching their response, because I thought I owed it to them. You know, I'm going to just speak out the sentences that I have written and see your response.
This is before publication.
Oh yeah, this was a fact check. And it was part of the process of fact checking, but also a preparation, right? I wanted them to know what was coming. And as Dasani at one point said, you know, I lived all of this, so I don't really even need to hear it, Andrea. But I think that that was her sensation of the book, was she lived this and now she's reading it. And she wants other people to come away from her story having felt something change in themselves. I think that's her hope. But
a lot of courage in that.
Yeah. And she's broken some barriers in her life. I mean, she graduated from high school, she left she came back home, repatriated herself with her family, you know, became whole again, felt that she was finally back on I would call it an authentic path towards success, something that felt that she wasn't having to trade her sense of well-being and home and culture for success, that she was doing all things at once by living with her family after a long court battle, being reunited with her mother and 2 of her siblings, living with them in a Section 8 voucher supported apartment. She graduated from high school, and she is a freshman in CUNY studying business administration. So she's trying, and she's had some jobs. Her mom has a job right now making deliveries. So I'd say that they feel that they're on an upswing. Yeah,
absolutely. I'd like to end with policy questions, and we might have time for 2, maybe 1 or 2, but I'm going to try to channel and summarize the policy questions we've received. I think they can be broken up into 2 parts. The first part is, who's responsible for this? Do you point to a city agency? Do you point to a certain decision we've made as a country for the fact that 1 in 5 of our kids don't have basic necessities? The fact that 1 in 12 homeless kids go to school that are in New York City. Who's responsible? The second question, the second policy question is, what should we do? And I know journalists don't like getting questions like that, but I'd really value a really specific answer on that second one.
I appreciate the frankness of your question. And it's true, we don't like to get put on the hat of policymaker because we are not trained to do that. However, having been on the ground day after day in these various systems with this family for so long, I would be remiss not to share some of my observations about what I think worked and what didn't work. And I think the two big takeaways for me are, actually there's three. So something to do with housing is, very important that I want to say, and then also related to history. And then I'm just writing these down so I can remember them, and then child protection. So first of all, I came into this project sort of describing what I was doing with the labels that are assigned to a kid like Dasani that describe a current plight: homeless, poor. I don't think we can see those labels absent their historical context. And I think it's really, really important to connect those dots. And this is what I try to do in this book. And so you cannot look at Dasani's poverty without seeing its racial underpinnings. And you can see this, it takes you back to the Jim Crow South. It takes you back to redlining in Brooklyn. Her lack of money is merely the point of departure for understanding her human condition. And in order to understand the roots of her poverty, you must look at what happened to her great-grandfather, June Sykes, who fought and risked his life for the military, and a segregated military in World War II, came back with 3 Bronze Service Stars and was still denied the basic dignities of white veterans that allowed them to join America's middle class by becoming homeowners, by working in their own chosen professions. You look at the difference between what he earned and what he could have earned in his chosen profession when he was trained as a mechanic. And the difference between those two wages is about $200,000 over the course of his working life. That is, people love to bash government aid and the safety net. That is the hidden safety net of white families, is wealth, intergenerational wealth, that is passed through real estate and other things that was denied this family. So I think I'd start there. I think that's just an important kind of grounding in discussing the issues. I think when you look at systems, you made this point very beautifully and very powerfully in your book, Matt. I mean, housing is a human right. And what worked for this family most was stable housing. The best moments of their lives were moments when they could have a home that they could call their own by virtue of Section 8. And when you think about the fact that something like 3% of Americans have access to public housing or vouchers, it's astounding, especially when so many Americans spend 50% or more of their income on rent. The rent burden is untenable. So that's a huge problem that needs to be fixed. And New York City is interesting because it's the only right to shelter. It provides a legal right to shelter that other cities don't. So in a way, there is a solution in place, but it's a very flawed one. It's temporary, it's punitive. The other major system that I think needs attention is the child protection system. And that's a system where the federal government spends 10 times as much on separating families and on keeping them together. Programs that include foster care, adoption, versus programs that invest in the family as an asset and would help a family like Dasani's keep the wheels on by doing basic things. So when you catch a case in this system, and the vast majority of the families are Black and brown. The vast majority in New York City are there for neglect, not abuse. So they're being accused of neglecting, which is failure to provide adequate housing, adequate clothing. These are poverty-related problems. What they're usually done, what's usually done to these families, as opposed to families of means when they are in crisis and everyone rallies around with casseroles and I'm going to make phone calls and help you. What happens to poor families when they are in crisis is that the burdens are increased. So suddenly in this system, they have to go to parenting classes. They have to stop missing appointments at welfare, and maybe they have to join a new drug treatment program. And so the hurdles are just greater in the midst of crisis. And what this family needed was help making phone calls. It was basically, I think, just a social worker without the stigma of a social worker in their presence to just have the lights turned back on, to help draw a bath, to help get the kids to school on time. This isn't a permanent solution, but it is a costly one. And yet what people love to talk about is the costs of things like supportive housing, like preventive programs, rather than looking at the cost of what happens when in the absence of those programs, which is huge. I mean, the impact of foster care, of homelessness on a kid like Dasani long-term, when you look at incarceration rates, when you look at teenage pregnancy, all of the markers, those costs are huge. So I think the conversation has to change around even just costs, basic costs, and what we're investing in.
Yeah. That's our hour.
There's so much to talk about, but
there's so much more to talk about. But thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate your questions and your time.
Seriously, thank you. I mean, it's been really amazing to listen in. You're sort of disproving what's become this inner measure for what a Zoom hour is, right? That we all sort of feel like we only have attention for an hour. I think many of us here would have attention for more, but there's also dinners to be had. I would love nothing better than to take the two of you to a meal. I have lots of questions coming out of this conversation and this amazing book. I'll say that I kind of wished it had a different title. You know, I was sort of thinking, I don't know, struggle, poverty, struggle, and grit, or something like that. There's so much I'd love to talk to you about. Also, the representation, the politics of the representation of hope.
But she feels very hopeful, I will say, about her life.
You feel, yeah, and resilient, and there's so much love, but at the same time, I remember so well a sentence from Dasani's mother, where she says, "When I get my kids back, that's when you'll see me frown." Yes. So, you know, we also expect. We don't, you know, it's like the poor also can't afford not to embody hope, and we can't allow them to. So there, but which points to this other dimension that's so beautifully handled in your book, which is the anger. Also, I mean, there's love, there's hope, there's strength, but there's also anger, valid anger, and you help us understand the anger in all of it. You help us understand the full range of emotions. And so I'm ending where Matt began, with just thank you for this book. Thank you for this book. Thank you for this hour. Thanks to all of you for being here with us. And I hope to meet you in person, Andrea. I hope to see you soon, Matt, and see many of you if you're here in Princeton also real soon. Be well, take care. Read that sign, Matt, that's behind you. There's a glare on it, but I think that it says the work continues, stay true. Is that right?
Continue, stay true. Yeah.
Stay true. Okay, I think this will be my closeout now for all my Zoom meetings. Let's end with that. Okay.
So much.
Take care and thank you.
Bye.